Great. Well, thank you everyone for joining us online or here in Green Hall on the University of Minnesota St. Paul campus. I'm Matt Russell with the University of Minnesota. Really happy today to really talk about forest management in Minnesota, and in particular a couple of recent studies, surveys that have gone out to natural resource professionals and the logging community about what it means, what's going on with Minnesota's forest management. And so these are all important issues that we're facing with today. And these two studies, I think, are going to shed some light onto that. So the way this will work, Marcella Windmuller-Campione will speak first about the silvicultural practices study, and then Charlie Blinn will speak second about the logging study. And so we anticipate about 20 or 25 minutes for each of those presentations. We encourage you to ask questions, and we can relay those questions to Marcella and to Charlie. And the way to do that on the WebEx system is if you look in the lower right, there should be a chat area. So if you open up that area, you can type your question there. When you type your question, do type it to all participants. When you write your question, send it to all participants. And that way we know that we'll get it here in the room and we can relay those messages to the speakers. Other notes, we had a webinar last month on physiology and drought. We encourage you to take a look at that webinar if you missed that one. We can have a link that we'll share to that webinar maybe toward the end of this webinar. And also next month's webinar is focused on the Urban Forest Inventory and Analysis Program. And so it's kind of some new insights from that new program and really some emphasis on what's going on in Minnesota for next month's webinar. But for today, I'll turn it over to Dr. Marcella Windmuller-Campione, and she's going to talk about the silvicultural practices and some forest health things that are going on in Minnesota today. So
Perfect.
Take it away.
Thank you, Matt. And I guess thanks for everyone for joining us on such a beautiful day. So yeah, so a little bit about what I'm going to be talking about. So some of you may know, or some of you participated that are listening. A group of us within the university are continuing on this kind of strong background, strong study in understanding trends in silvicultural practices. So in 2017, we sent out that survey. We'll go in a little bit of history and background, some updated numbers, and I'm going to stress throughout the presentation, these are preliminary numbers. We will be doing a full report, and we'll make sure that's available to everyone in the SFEC group and online and through the University of Minnesota. So we'll talk about some updated numbers, but those are kind of preliminary numbers. We'll talk a little bit about current practices versus past practices, and then also some of our current concerns in terms of forest health, invasives, and how we are managing them. We'll give an update on the full report and take some time for questions before transitioning to Dr. Charlie Blinn with the logging sector survey. So that's kind of my goal for today. So we have preliminary results, and this work is done in collaboration with Matt Russell, Eli Sagor, and Madison Rodman, as well as all the people that filled out the surveys. I cannot thank you enough. So a little bit of background. So as many of you know that are listening, silvicultural practices are dynamic. So silviculture is shaped by the goals and values. And so as our values, as our goals change, as the threats that we're managing for, we're going to see changes in how we practice silviculture and the types of treatments we're using. So this is really kind of dynamic and based on societal needs and values, also forest conditions. So how our forests are developing, what products we need, what is the highest and greatest value, and how we manage those trade-offs. Also, of course, forest health issues. We'll be talking about invasives as well as our natives. So eastern larch beetle, emerald ash borer, these are big kind of concerns right now. And then also the development and implementation of best management practices, including residuals and those types of issues. So we'll touch briefly on those. We'll talk more about those in the full report. And Minnesota, we are lucky to have multiple different types of organizations managing our forest. I think that is so cool to see how different organizations use the same silvicultural tools to meet different needs for their organizations, for their stakeholders, for their constituents. And we have a strong history of documenting this from 1991 to 96, and 2008 was the last one that was put out by Tony D'Amato and colleagues in 2009. So we'll be looking to put ours out in 2018, so slightly less than a decade after that last one. So the goal of our survey was to learn more about the silvicultural and forest health practices across Minnesota in 2016, and this is slightly probably different than the last survey or your most recently completed fiscal year, since we do have such a diversity of organizations, those fiscal years are not the same for every organization. So I'll be using kind of 2016, but realize those dates are not exact dates and they kind of relate to that fiscal year for different organizations. So the survey was developed and approved by, I guess, the Institutional Review Board at the University of Minnesota, so going through all the correct practices, and we really focused on questions on forest management, kind of areas and management activities, the types of silvicultural practices used, even-aged, uneven-aged, and tending. We also looked at regeneration. I won't be talking about regeneration in this presentation. We'll talk a little bit about forest health concerns and issues, as well as tools used for treating those issues. And then there were open areas for comments, concerns, and thoughts, and that's something we're still kind of in collation. So the initial survey was shared with participants in fall of 2017, and of course after 2/3 bad winters, we timed our survey perfectly with the beginning of a great harvest condition for those that needed winter harvest. So we are still getting surveys coming in and hope to get a few more. So these are preliminary results, and we hope to have that final report in 2018. So by the end of this year, that should be out. So who took the survey so far? And if we look at kind of 2017, 2008, and 1996, we see we have pretty good representation, especially in terms of industrial, state, and tribal representative. We're kind of right on line. We're also bringing in some other ownerships, which is pretty cool to see the state diversifying in types of ownership of forest and forests that are actively managed. Slightly lower in county, and hopefully we'll add some numbers in terms of our federal participants to bring up that number. So what's going on in our forest operations? So we have about 57% of the acres, areas of timberland captured in our survey. So we're just under 9 million acres of managed forest land. So that's pretty impressive that we have that within the state, and we've captured that within the survey. We see this varies, of course, by organization, from county, other ownerships, as well as state. So we see a large diversity in the amount of acres that each organization owns, as well as, but even within that ownership, there's a pretty consistent percentage of the areas being managed. Right around that 1% is actively harvested. And then, of course, we have numbers of cords, boards, and biofuels harvested. And I'm not going to read those numbers off. I'm going to leave this up for just a second more, and then we're going to transition into how these numbers relate to previous surveys. So in comparison, the 2008 survey, you saw that there's slightly higher survey results that they had for their final results. Again, we're hoping to get a few more surveys in, but they had 9.8 million. So we're not too far off from their total number of acres. And we see again, we're a little lower on the number of acres harvested. Oops. But we're seeing that we're kind of right in line from 2008, probably, if we take into account that difference in the acres we captured. We're right on line kind of with the total harvested area. That's it's still lower than 1996, where we're just under 100,000 acres harvested. And our cords harvested is, again, a little lower, but again, that might be just because of the number missing a few respondents still. So 1.97 million cords in 2008 and 1996 compared to roughly 1.3 in 2017. In terms of sales offered and sales not sold, so a high number of sales were offered, especially on county and state lands. And the difference is with a slightly higher percentage, well, a lot of sales offered, but a slightly higher percentage not sold on state and tribal land than, say, county and other ownerships, not having very high success rate of 100% of their sales selling during that fiscal year. But again, we're looking at under with 16% not selling. So we're not looking at a huge amount of sales being put up and not sold and not being utilized. So now transitioning into these silvicultural practices. So, and we will kind of look at this in comparison, and I know this is a big graph or a big table, so I'm not going to walk through each piece, but I do want to be able to show these kind of comparisons and differences with thinking about size and thinking about how we can use management to meet different goals, different values in terms of timber products, in terms of wildlife habitat. These are all different tools, with even age systems, especially clear cuts, being a really important way to generate young new forests, which can be really important for many different wildlife species, as well as providing important timber products. So we see that on average, we're looking at around a 17-acre clear cut block. And those of you that, as I'm talking, are doing the math and saying that doesn't add up in terms of average, it is a weighted average. So we see that organizations such as private industry are doing a slightly larger than average clear cut block at 91 acres, whereas state, which has a higher amount of total clear cut acres that they're doing, but the average clear cut block is 13 acres. So that's all taken into account when we're getting this kind of 17-acre average. We see in terms of this use of a kind of clear cut system is the predominant even age management that we are seeing used in Minnesota. We're seeing very little of the strip clear cut, slightly more of the shelter wood, and also a little more of the seed tree. But our clear cut system is kind of the predominant even age system that is being used. So how does that compare, say, from past studies? So some notable kind of percentages. So 1.5% of the acres treated using even age methods used a shelter wood in 2017. And this is down slightly from 2.7 in 2008. And we are also seeing a slight decline from 25 acres in 2008 to 17 acres in 2017. And this decline is a slight decline, but we also see that there are still organizations and still groups that are doing these larger cuts. And I do also want to remember that the time when we asked people to relay this information was, of course, not only right after during a good winter, but it was right after a large storm hit most of northern Minnesota, with some areas having severe damage. And I'm sure many of you that were in areas that were affected also remember multiple days of power outages, as well as the big cleanup that happened. So we haven't touched on salvage and sanitation harvest yet. We will be running that analysis soon, but just kind of have this in the back of the mind, especially when looking at, say, potentially these larger clear-cut blocks. Maybe that was spurred by the storm, or kind of some of these changes that we're seeing. So moving into our uneven age systems, we see an increase of acres harvested using uneven age systems in 2017 compared to 2008. So we're up to almost 6% of the harvested acres using uneven age systems, with probably twice to 3 times as much use of, wow, that's really sensitive, man. Probably 3 times as much use is the group selection harvest compared to our single tree selection. And if we think about the species that we have here, that makes a lot of sense in terms of the tools that we're using to meet our management goals and objectives. We see the state contributing high with almost 77 average acres in that group selection, with county at 22, so just slightly below that average. And then moving on to thinning or intermediate treatments. So we're seeing our average commercial clear cut or average commercial thinning block right around that 14.5 acres, with tribal and county slightly higher than that, and state and private slightly lower. But we're looking at just over 12,000 acres that were commercially thinned during that fiscal year. So now let's move into why we might be managing, and one of those management might be due to forest health concerns. So for a series of questions, we asked, what are some of the forest health concerns? Are they present, and are you managing? So the first question really focused on this threat is not known on the land. And we see, thankfully, some of these species or some of these insects and diseases that can cause a huge amount of issues, including oak wilt, gypsy moth, emerald ash borer, and things like large case bearer, are not present on a high amount of our respondents, whereas things like white pine blister rust, dwarf mistletoe, bark beetles, again, not surprising based on when we did the survey, wind throw and blow down, no one was not dealing with that. So I guess that gives us confidence that we did actually have our respondents responded accurately, and I guess what was happening. So that was a good kind of test that people weren't going through autopilot. So we see certain things as an issue versus certain things that aren't an issue, which is, I guess I'm assuming when the survey goes out, maybe in the next decade, EAB is no longer going to be not on, this threat is not known on our land, is probably going to keep decreasing, and probably move down to that wind throw and blow down, or forest tent caterpillar area. So the threat is present, but we are not treating it. So this is kind of looking at if this is present, and then if it is kind of something that you're using silvicultural tools. So we see forest tent caterpillar and dwarf mistletoe are present on over 50% of the respondents' lands, but there's not any silvicultural actions that are currently being used for it. Compared to when it is present, things like emerald ash borer, these are coming out as lower. So how are these treating it? And yes, this is a huge multifaceted figure, but we're going to kind of walk through. So I do want to kind of organize you or kind of key you in. So we have the insect threats on the left-hand side of the screen, and we have more of our disease and pathogen threats on the right side. We have these different kind of treatments, including clear cutting, improved growing stock, partial salvage harvest, promoting mixed species, pruning, salvage harvest, slash removal, and thinning. And that's the exact same on this other side. So the treatments are the same, the diseases and issues are slightly different. So let's kind of look at what we have. So one thing that we are seeing is clear cutting is a tool that is being used for certain species, including dwarf mistletoe, issues with diplodia and Serracoccus, so shoot blights, as well as issues in aspen with hypoxylin. We see also about around 20% of respondents are using clear cutting to treat certain diseases, including things like emerald ash borer, eastern larch beetle, and spruce budworm. We see these partial harvests are treating some of the same insects and diseases, but we're seeing it's hitting on slightly different ones, including partial salvage harvest in areas impacted by white pine blister rust, or the promotion of mixed species stand for white pine blister rust. as well as promoting mixed species in emerald ash borer, or areas that will be impacted by emerald ash borer. So it's cool to see things like projects that have been presented as webinars through SFEC with the Chippewa project with black ash, seeing those results being implemented on the ground, as well as we look at promoting mixed species stands for things like the two-line chestnut blower, as well as those are the two big ones. And then we see partial salvage harvest for eastern large beetle, as well as kind of budworm. So all things that are not surprising, but really great to kind of see, especially that promoting mixed species stand come out with EAB. And then moving into thinking about thinning, we see, especially with bark beetles, that thinning is a common treatment that's used by almost 50% of respondents for bark beetles, with slightly lower response rate for emerald ash borer. We see slash removal as a really key component of maintaining or treating for bark beetles. Less so when we look at some of the disease and pathogens over here, but pretty nice to see that bark beetle piece coming out. So what are the biggest threats on the horizon? And this isn't a surprise at all, with emerald ash borer coming out at the highest, with over 50% of the respondents saying that's their priority. Eastern larch beetle, another big threat, and we see windthrow and blowdown as well as spruce beetle kind of rounding out. And emerald ash borer, eastern larch beetle, these are of course been issues that have been touched on and will continue to be touched on as we think about how we treat for both of these species, especially this one currently and this one now and into the future. So moving into from EAB into other invasive species, we see that almost 74% of respondents are managing for invasive plants. The big ones that are coming up on that management include knapweed and tansy, and as well as wild parsnip, which is very concerning that almost 50% of people are already, respondents are seeing this as an issue. So I guess also thank you for managing it for it. So, but it's also slightly concerning just because what that species can do. We see buckthorn and things like garlic mustard and thistle kind of rounding out that lower area. So kind of wrapping this up, we still have a bit to go in terms of the analysis. So some of this is because we are waiting on those additional surveys to come in, and we do want to make sure we get this full picture of what Minnesota is doing, how silvicultural practices are being conducted, evolving, being used to meet the goals and objectives of different organizations. So we will, of course, be doing that full write-out and make sure that's available and shared. And it's really nice to be able to have this survey to document, I guess, sustainable forest management practices in Minnesota, and have it explore the multiple different forest organizations. So looking at those different goals and objectives, the different concerns, how organizations are using different silvicultural systems. But what's ringing through is, no matter who you are, no matter what organization you work for, similar issues with invasive species, insects, and diseases are going to ring through. So I think we can use tools like silviculture, and especially tools like the Great Lakes Silviculture Library, to be able to explore both treatments that have worked, treatments that have not worked as we intended, and just use these tools to kind of keep maintaining good, healthy, resilient forests. So, of course, some acknowledgments. Thank you to our funding sources, as well as, we cannot say this enough, thank you to all the different organizations who provided input on the design of the survey, as well as who took the survey. We know this was a time commitment, and we so appreciate that time and effort that went into completing the survey. And with that, I can pause for questions.
Yeah, if you're online, if you do have questions, feel free to type them into the chat area, and we can relay them. We have one question. What are the implications of a reduced average clear-cut size for wildlife habitat?
Yeah, I'm not, I'm only guessing who that person is, but yeah, I think there's some big implications in terms of thinking about especially that early stages of stand development, and whether that's for commercial species such as grouse, whether it's for neotropical migrants. It's really important to look at both the stand and the larger landscape level. So if we are seeing changes in that average clear-cut block size, we might be shifting from, say, large stand replacing disturbances to a different set of disturbances, and that has implication to wildlife. I think it was really interesting. We still have to run a lot of numbers, but it'll be interesting to see variation in terms of max and min, and see if we are still getting some of those large clear-cut blocks. So I think it was industry that still had an average size of 91 acres. So we are seeing variability. But it is something that hopefully we can come together across disciplines, especially when talking about something that can be sometimes seen as contentious as a clear cut. So thinking that clear cuts provide the requirements for certain silvicultural aspects. So the silvics of certain species require that light environment, but also wildlife requires that habitat that tool provides.
Another question along the lines of clear-cut blocks. Can you talk a little bit more about the reserves being held in clear-cut blocks? Was a percentage of reserves included in the survey? And also, is there a percentage at which a clear-cut with reserves turns into a different silvicultural system?
Oh man, no, we have not. Okay, yes, so we do have information on best management practices, including reserves or residuals. We have not analyzed that data yet, but it will be forthcoming. In terms of when that reserves transitions into a different silvicultural treatment, that's a very good question, and one that really depends on each, within that individual stand, what are the goals for those reserve trees? So are they producing seed? Are they maintaining wildlife habitat? And then you can make the argument, if they are producing seed or providing shelter, does that shift it into a seed tree with reserves, or a shelter wood with reserves, or a two-age system compared to a traditional clear cut? It also then brings, especially how the residuals are kind of grouped, whether they're clumped versus aggregated, or clumped versus evenly distributed. If you clump them, are you creating almost two stand, one that was clear cut and one that was reserved? So I guess there's lots of ways we can discuss the terminology, but I think some of that's getting a little into the weeds and makes for great kind of scientific discussion, but I don't know if it's, I think we'll get into some of those numbers. Yeah.
Question. I was concerned by the zero response rate from the Forest Service, from the Superior and Chippewa. I'm wondering if you could, if you kind of alluded to hoping that you're going to get responses from them, or what's the status of that? And because that really is significant vis-a-vis the previous surveys and responses that were received from them. They're a significant landowner.
Yeah, so we are so the question was regarding that kind of 0% in terms of federal ownership, and we are hoping to work with our federal partners to get that data. So we are working and in communication with them, but with a federal hiring freeze and some other external factors, it's hard. So we are, that's why we're at a longer period of survey return to make sure we are working with organizations, just given that we lucked out on getting a federal hiring freeze, a really good winter, and some other factors that we had no control of, or no, I guess, yeah, we had no control over good winter or federal hiring freeze when thinking of when we were going to send out this survey.
Sure.
So,
Thanks.
yeah. Awesome.
Thank you, Marcella. And Marcella, I think, is going to stick around. So if you do have questions, we hope to have a few minutes at the end to relay those to Marcella and to our next speaker. If you just give me a minute, I'm going to get things set up here. So Marcella talked a lot about this kind of silviculture that we're doing, but that all needs to be done by somebody. And so Dr. Charlie Blinn is here to tell us about the logging businesses and give us an update on kind of the health and the viability of where the logging businesses are based on some data that was collected in 2016. So take it away, Charlie.
Thanks, Matt. And as Matt said, really, silviculture and logging really are well linked together, so it makes sense for the two of us to kind of present our information together. This data is also from 2016, and so what I'll do is provide an overview of the Minnesota data, but also we spent some time during this survey collecting some data from Wisconsin and Michigan. So at the end, I'll talk a little bit about that data from those other two states. So a study like this is a cooperative between Minnesota Forest Industries, the Minnesota Logger Education Program, the U.S. Forest Service, and the University of Minnesota. And maybe three kind of summary comments that I might make before I get into it are that it seems that in comparison to previous surveys, our respondents seem to be more optimistic this year than they had been in some of the more recent surveys. We saw a continuing dichotomy of production among our respondents, with a lot of small producers that in total produce a small amount of volume, but a small number of large producers who produce a very large percentage of the volume. That's a continuation from past. And those larger producers tend to think about the world of logging in a much better kind of part of the world or in framework than the small producers did. So we'll see some of that too. And then we asked loggers too about what would encourage someone else to become a logger. And there's not much that provides much optimism for loggers talking well about others joining the logging industry. So what I'll do is talk a little bit briefly about background and approach, then talk about our Minnesota results in three different sections. The demographics, talking about some business relationships in terms of full capacity, their break-even volume, and then profitability. Talk about the future, and then kind of sum up the Minnesota information. Then I've got 2 or 3 slides presenting information from our 2 Lake States partners. So we've done previous surveys. The first one was done by Kip Bolstead back in the late 70s. Then the second one was part of the GEIS in 1991. We did a follow-up in 96, another one in 2003, 2011, and then this one in 2016. And as Marcella did, we designed a survey, shared it with cooperators, ran it through the Institutional Review Board at the University of Minnesota. And we worked closely in this survey with our partners in Wisconsin and Michigan to design a survey that asked similar questions across the 3 states. They were worded consistently, and they went out to potential respondents at the same time. So it allows us, for the first time ever, to be able to collect and compare some data across our 3 states. So as we did it, we also deleted all responses from anyone who produced under 100 cords, because we felt that that's what we'd done in previous surveys, thinking that if you're under 100 cords, you're probably not logging much. So in this survey, we had 140 usable responses for a 39% response rate. So looking at some of the demographics of our businesses, and I would mention that there were 45 questions in the survey, and I'll just provide an overview of a very small number of those questions. So there's a lot more that could be dug into that I'm not going to do at this time. So the average business in 2016 produced 11,267 cords, which is about 1,700 more cords than in the previous survey. The median, again, was about 4,000 as compared to the 2011 survey. They used about 1.5 gallons of gas or fuel to produce a cord of wood in woods. And the average business had been in business for just over 30 years. And if you look, we're really aging our businesses. Back in '96, it was about 17 and a half years, and now it's just over 30 and a half. And then the graph at the bottom shows years in business on the horizontal axis, and then percent of responses on the vertical axis. And you can see on the left, the gold bar is 2003, the blue bar is 2011, and the maroon bar is 2016. So we're continuing to shift more toward older businesses and recruiting a few businesses in the lower end, but we're definitely aging our logging businesses. So this is kind of a confusing graph, so let's just first focus on the bars and forget the lines that are on there. For many of the things that we look at, are there differences in production capacity of our respondents? And so we asked them, how much volume did you produce? And then broke them out into those 5 volume categories that you see at the bottom. On the left-hand axis, you see the percent of businesses represented by those bars. And so again, the gold is 2003, the blue is 2011, and the maroon is 2016. So you can see that there are many businesses that produced up to 5,000 cords, but few businesses produced more than 15,000 cords. Then if you look at the lines represented by the percent of harvest volume on the right-hand side, the lines really show kind of how much, what percent of the total volume was produced by each one of those 5 different production categories. So we can see that 56% of our respondents produced a total of about 9% of our reported volume. 18% of our respondents produced 68% of our reported volume. And as you look at the blue and the maroon lines, they're almost on top of each other. So we're getting similar results from 2011 to 2016. We continue to fell most of our timber in this state using feller bunchers. We decreased the volume, percent of volume from 82 to 74% using feller bunchers, and then increased it for cut to length from 16 to 24, and chainsaws continue to be about 2% of the total volume that was felled. This is now the 5th time that we've asked the question, what percent of your volume did you harvest by season? And we define season to be December, January, February is what we call winter. And then March, April, May are spring, as you see in the left-hand box there. And we use those categories because when we first started doing this many, many years ago, those were the categories, and we just continued them since then. So in the 2016 survey, 53% of the volume was harvested during winter. That's an increase over what it was in 2011 when it was 51%. And going back to 1991, it was 43% was harvested during the winter. So we're seeing a shift, continuing shift toward more and more, a higher percentage of our volume being harvested during the winter. And the average business harvested during 3 seasons. So what did they do when they weren't harvesting timber? Many of them reported something related to agriculture. Either it was livestock production or row crop production. And we asked, what's the average age of your newest piece of mechanized felling equipment? It could be a feller buncher, it could be a cut-to-length system. And so breaking it out into 6 volume categories on the horizontal axis, again, we can see that in 2011 and in 2016, that those lower producing businesses tend to have the oldest, newest piece of mechanized felling equipment. And so that they tend also to not harvest on a year-round basis, and so it may make sense to them not to purchase a lot of new equipment. Whereas those who depend upon the equipment and probably are operating 4 seasons out of the year tend to have the newest equipment. So that's just an overview of some of the basic demographics of our logging sector. Then some of the business things looked at, did you operate at full capacity in 2016? In other words, did you produce as much as you think you could have produced? Did you break even during 2016? And how would you rate your profitability? So we asked those questions. So 34% of our respondents said that my business operated at full capacity in 2016. And so on the x-axis or the horizontal axis, again, we can see those volume categories. And on the y-axis or the vertical axis, we can see percent of respondents. And so kind of drawing a circle around 3 of those categories and kind of follow those as we move through some of the subsequent slides, you'll notice that there are 3 categories that tended to say that I operated either at full capacity, I did a better job breaking even, or my profit level was higher in 2016 than the other groups that are depicted in these slides. So on average, the additional capacity for anyone who didn't produce at full capacity was about 5,400 cords. And looking at felling methods, the feller buncher had the highest additional capacity. And overall, 55% of the additional capacity was in winter. In terms of break-even volume, we asked them, did you break even in 2016? It was simply yes or no. And so the smallest producers tended to not break even. They needed to produce an additional 61% more volume than they did produce in order to break even. But again, looking at our 3 categories of 5,001 to 10,000 and then above 15,000, those 3 tended to think that they produced at a break-even volume or better. So as we go farther out to the right, they not only broke even, but thought that they really did well making a profit. On average, across all businesses, the average was 117% to break even, but the median was 100. In terms of looking at their profit, we asked them about their level of profitability in 2016. Was it very poor, average, good, or excellent? 39% of our respondents said it was either good or excellent, and only 26% said it was poor or very poor. But as we look at our categories that I mentioned before, half the businesses that produced between 5,001 to 10,000 or between 15 to 20,000 cords reported good or excellent versus the overall average of 39%. So that's just a quick overview of some of the financials for responding businesses. Then kind of looking at the future, where do they see kind of the industry going from their perspective? So we asked them, would you encourage a family member or a close friend to become a logger? And the potential responses were yes, no, or I'm just not sure. So on average, 20% of our respondents said, yes, I would encourage a family member or a close friend to become a logger. And that didn't vary much across our respondents, up to a high of 25, down to a low of 17%. So on average, about 40% of our respondents said no, and another 40% said, I'm just not sure. We also asked them, what was important in your decision, you the respondent, in entering the logging business? Remember, some of these people have been in business for 30 plus years. We asked this on a scale of 1 to 5, where 5 was a very important reason for entering the business, 5 was extremely important, 4 was very important, all the way down to a 2, which was just a little bit important. We had these 9 different factors that were listed, and then in other also. And so the kind of things that really were extremely important to them were things like, I enjoy a sense of independence. I enjoy working outdoors, and it gives me a sense of accomplishment. But if you look at the bottom, those kind of things that might attract someone to the profession, like it pays well, it's a respected profession, tended to rate really low. And there was one respondent who wrote in for other, the reason that I'm in the logging business is I hate people. And then we asked them what factors would encourage or discourage entry of people to enter the profession. Again, it was on a 5-point scale, where 5 would have been extremely encouraging and 4 being very encouraging. So nothing averaged above a 3, neither encourages nor discourages. So the highest rated thing was the work environment. which isn't good for everyone, obviously. And then all the way down to the benefits package, which was greatly discourages to somewhat discourages. So there's not a lot of things really bringing people into the logging profession today based on our respondents. So kind of a quick summary of the Minnesota responses. They're running a conventional business with a feller buncher and probably 2 grapple skidders. They've been in business longer than they've been in business in 2011. They do expect to be in business in 5 years from now. They're more optimistic than they were in 2011. They produce more volume in 2011 they produced more volume than they did in 2011. And they slightly increased the winter wood percentage as compared to 2011. So that trend is continuing to cut more winter wood. The average business operates in 3 seasons, but the average business that didn't operate at full capacity could have produced about 5,400 more cords in 2016. And of that additional capacity, about 55% of that is in winter. Their access to capital isn't hard. So they're able to access capital to buy stumpage and also to buy new equipment. And nearly 40% of the reported profitability was good or excellent in 2016. And as they look at replacing equipment, most of that's going to be with pre-owned or used equipment. So the owners like to be independent, they like being outdoors, they like that sense of accomplishment, but it is a physically demanding, low pay, low to no benefits in an industry that people think has poor health. So there doesn't really seem to be a lot to encourage others to enter the profession. But now looking again at those categories, and I'll call a small producer someone who produced up to 5,000 cords, and a large producer someone who produced more than 15,000 cords. Let's look at how they responded to some of the questions. So those smaller producers, in terms of reported volume, again, it was 9%, 68% of the total reported volume for the large producers. Average age of newest piece of mechanized equipment, 18 years versus 5.7. The smaller producers operate in 2.7 seasons versus 3.7 for larger producers, in which transport is with cable and grapple skidders versus grapple skidders and, in many cases, forwarders too. We asked them, is there a family member who might take over your business? For small producers, it's only 27% of respondents. For larger producers, it's 61%. Access to capital is below average for smaller producers and better than average for large producers. More large producers operated full capacity, and their additional capacity as a large business would be during the summer. They feel that they're already fully worked out during the winter, and so for them, they need more access to summer stumpage. In terms of those who broke even, 82% of the respondents who were large producers said, I broke even, whereas only 58% for small producers. And those who said that 2016 was better than 2013 was an additional 15%, going from 30 up to 45%. So in essence, just by looking at the data, it looks like our larger producers tended to think that 2016 was a better year, and my business is probably in better shape at this point than those small producers. So this is the first time we've ever done a joint survey with Wisconsin and Michigan. They've always done surveys, but they've always been in different years than our Minnesota surveys. We've asked sometimes similar questions, but they've been worded in a dissimilar manner. So it made sense for us to try to jointly produce some questions that could be replicated across our 3 states. So when we did that, the response rate for Michigan was 23%, 59% for Wisconsin, and you can see that number of responses in the 3 states. So I have just 2 tables. One looks at, all tables look at factors on the left-hand column, and then Michigan, Minnesota, and Wisconsin. This first table looks at ways in which I think, in a non-statistical sense, just by looking at the data, we look to be somewhat similar. And the second one is dissimilarities. So our years in operation, we're all up around 30 years, 25 to 30. The age of our owners is very similar. Number of years of existence of the business is very similar. Percent of businesses that harvest up to 5,000 cords is 50% in Michigan, 56% in Minnesota, 58% in Wisconsin. And the percent of the total volume harvested is a little bit different, but not really big differences. And then looking at the next row, in terms of those bigger businesses, 16% of the businesses in Michigan are at least 15,000 cord producers, and 10% in Wisconsin. And you can see the percent of total volume contributed by those producers. Within 60 miles of harvest sites, we're up about 87% for the 3 states. So our harvest sites away in distance away from where I live is about within 60 miles for about 87% of our respondents. Profitability in 2016, most businesses said it was average or broke even on average. And so break-even volume was very close, around 10,500 cords. Whether they expected to be in business in 5 years, about 70 to 75%. Whether they would encourage a family member or a close friend to become a logger, about 18 to 23%. Why'd you enter the logging business? Independence was number 1 in all 3 states. Outdoors, 2. The sense of accomplishment, number 3. And then the top 3 factors that would encourage entry, again, all low rated in the 3 states, where the work environment was number 1, availability of competing jobs was 2 in Michigan and Wisconsin, and then prestige was 3 in those other 2 states, and just a flip on 2 and 3 in Minnesota. So there are a lot of ways in which our 3 states seem to be pretty similar in terms of our logging businesses. This next slide then shows dissimilarities. And I've put a box around those that tend to be different, I think, from the other 2 states. So as an example, the average volume produced by a Wisconsin respondent is about 2,300 to 3,000 cords less than it is in Michigan and Minnesota. The average percent of volume from family forests is much higher in Michigan and Wisconsin than in Minnesota. Percent of volume felled by a chainsaw is much higher in the other 2 states than in Minnesota. And then the percent of businesses that have multiple owners is higher in Minnesota than the other 2 states. Equipment tends to be younger in Michigan, the age of the newest feller buncher. The number of the tracks that were completed that were greater than 40 acres, it's much higher percentage in Michigan than in Minnesota or Wisconsin. That kind of goes along with some of the data that Marcella showed, that many of our tracks tend to be smaller than 40 acres. Percent of volume hauled by trucks owned by the business is much higher in Minnesota than the other 2 states. Capital investment is much higher in Michigan than in the other 2 states. And they invest a lot more, or a higher percentage of that capital, in equipment, and a lower percentage in stumpage in Michigan. And a higher percentage of businesses in Michigan tended to operate at full capacity. And our Minnesota businesses had more additional capacity than in the other 2 states. So again, like Marcella, we want to thank our cooperators, Minnesota Forest Industries, our Minnesota Logger Education Program, Forest Service, University of Minnesota, as well as the logging businesses that responded to our survey. Matt, I see we have about 5 minutes for questions.
Yeah, feel free to type any questions into the chat area. Any questions from here in St. Paul? Oh, maybe I have one, Charlie. The point about the multiple owners owning a business and that being higher in Minnesota compared to the other lake states, any reason or speculation to why that might be?
I couldn't tell you, Matt. Maybe there are differences in organizational structures among the 3 states, but I don't know for sure why. Maybe as we talk with our other 2 cooperators, we can figure that out, but haven't had a chance to discuss that with them yet.
One question from online. To what do you attribute differences in the type of harvesting equipment used in Minnesota versus Michigan and Wisconsin?
Yeah, silvicultural systems are quite a bit different, especially in Wisconsin. And so more uneven age management there, more clear cutting here. And so cut to length would work better. It's more productive in an uneven age system than a feller buncher would be.
Another online question for both. Where will the two reports be published?
The one in the logging industry will go as a staff paper on our departmental website. We're currently working through a rough draft of that right now, so I see by about mid-year we'll have that ready for publishing on the as a staff paper.
Yeah, I think that is also the plan for the updated silvicultural practices report. That will be a staff paper, and then we'll discuss more if that turns into a peer-reviewed paper as well.
And let me just ask Charlie, you've been doing this for quite a while, and I have some historical perspective. But based on this survey, but in comparison to all the others that you've been involved with for decades, where do you think the logging industry is going here in Minnesota? I mean, what maybe just share some thoughts and perhaps concerns related to where we're headed from the size of businesses, contraction, whatever else you might.
Right. So the question is kind of where are we going with the logging industry? Having a few gray hairs in my head, where do I think things are going? I think we're kind of headed in maybe the same direction the farming industry has gone. Kind of the contraction or the loss of the small farmer and more big farmers. And I think that's what we'll see more in the logging industry. So what does that mean if I own a small non-industrial private land holding and I want to get it logged? I probably need to work harder to get that cut. Find somebody who works in my area. Find somebody who lives in my area or works in my area, because they won't want to absorb a move cost for a very small production level off of some family forest. But in terms of attracting new people to the industry, to the logging industry, I think today's youth don't want to work that hard, that many hours, that many days during the year. They're just not attuned to what logging is. So what does that mean? One thought is that as I look around, who roofs houses in the Twin Cities? Who cleans buildings on the St. Paul campus? It's not people who speak English as a first language. It's some other language. It's happening in other parts of this country now that foresters are learning other languages to interact with the people who are running harvesting equipment. I think we'll see that also. We see it in planting crews. I think we'll see it in logging businesses too.
I'm not seeing any other questions unless we have some here. So let's thank Charlie and Marcella. And then I saw Madison just sent the link for continuing education credits. Do fill out that if you're interested. And our next webinar on June 19th, I believe, is on the urban forest. So do join us for that one. And we'll have a recording of this webinar that will be sent via email probably in a few days. So thanks again for joining us, and we'll see you soon.